All right, we're recorded. And so now I would like to just say a welcome to Bruce Dickey and all the cornetto players and trumpet players who've logged on today in this meeting. This will be archived on the Historic Brass Society YouTube channel. And if you wouldn't mind uh, muting your own identity on this Zoom meeting so that we can really hear carefully what's going on. And then later on, if you want to ask a question, don't hesitate to raise your hand or to put something in the chat, and we'll work that into the questions that we can do. So once again, welcome to, I would say, the world's most renowned cornetto player, Bruce Dickey, an American, but living in Italy, right outside of Bologna. He's taught for more than 40 years at the Schola Cantorum in Basel, Switzerland. And he's one of the co-founders of Concerto Palatino. He worked for nearly 10 years with Jordi Savall. He's just done everything, recorded so many different wonderful recordings. So anyway, thank you so much, and welcome to Bruce.
Thanks so much, Stan. It's great to finally do this. We talked about it for years. So here we are.
I know, it's wonderful. So I'm supposed to do kind of an interview, but I think it's going to be a little loose from time to time, so that allowing for possible questions or just diverging and talking about whatever might work. And once again, if you are in the group, please mute your microphones right now so we can focus on some of the answers that Bruce might have. So I will start out by asking this question. We don't know a whole lot about your early life growing up. So I would love to know a little bit about some of your early life musically and what sparked your interest in music, the trumpet, and then perhaps getting into early music.
Right. So I can't really, I grew up in the Midwest in South Bend, Indiana. And I can't really say that I grew up in a family of musicians, but both of my parents had played brass instruments in college. My father, the trombone, and my mom, the mellophone. So I guess there was a kind of, well, and also two of my mother's brothers were high school band directors when I was growing up. So I guess there was a kind of expectation that my brother and I would take up instruments when we were between third and fourth grade, which is what happened. And I was supposed to choose an instrument, and I wanted to play the cornet, the valve cornet. And the teacher said, well, my band director said, mostly today people play trumpet, so maybe you should take the trumpet. And no, I want to play the cornet. Not knowing the irony that would involve later in my life. I don't know why. I felt like the trumpet didn't express my personality somehow as much as I understood what that meant. So I did start on the cornet, and a couple of years later I was switched to the trumpet. And I have to say I had an excellent teacher through elementary, junior high, and high school. He was a very fine musician, but he was an incredibly frustrated school music teacher, orchestra conductor, and first trumpet in the South Bend Symphony Orchestra. And so my lessons were a kind of litany of complaints about the life of a musician. And oh man, you don't want to become a musician, you won't make any money, you're smart, you should study medicine or law or something, and don't get stuck in this music business. So I heard that for 10 years. As a result, when I went to college, I didn't start studying music. I mean, not at least not majoring in music. I was at Michigan State University. I was in a special kind of humanities program where I had three areas of study, and I studied philosophy and psychology and music theory, and I did a lot of actually interesting work in the psychology of music. But I I was there on a band scholarship, so I was playing trumpet. Um, but I was very unhappy with my trumpet lessons from a teacher. I won't mention his name. Some of you might know who that might have been back then. But I had never been a player with an easy high register. I was always told I was extremely musical and good technique, but my high register was never easy. And this teacher was not helping me with that. So at a certain point, through contact with a friend, I got interested in going down to Bloomington, Indiana, to Indiana University, and taking a few lessons with Bill Adam. Now, some of you may know about him, and if you do, you're probably thinking, that's kind of an odd match for what I ended up doing later in my life, and you'd be right. But he told me, "Oh yes, young man, we'll be fine. We need to change your embouchure." And so I embarked with him on a 3-year regime to change my embouchure, which was absolutely mind deadening. It was nothing but exercises, long tones, 4-5 hours a day. And after a year or a year and a half of that, though I was maybe making progress toward this goal that wasn't very clear, I got lost all interest in the trumpet. I lost what interest I had in the trumpet, which wasn't a huge amount. But I started to be incredibly frustrated that I couldn't play music. So I started playing the recorder and became quite serious about that. Got into a group at Indiana University that was playing early music, and I played all the winds, recorders, and reed instruments, and a little bit of cornetto on a very terrible Hermann Möck cornettino with a metal mouthpiece. I mean, it was just god awful, but I didn't know the difference. And so I played it a bit. And then, well, let's see. Well, yes, I decided then to go to Indiana University and enroll as a student. I wanted to study musicology there and end up in early music somehow. But I didn't have an undergraduate degree in music. So at Indiana, they said, well, you'll have to do the equivalent of an undergraduate degree before you can start your musicology studies. So, well, so I showed up there, and it meant, placement exams in theory and that sort of thing. That was fine, but I had to play a recital. And I was in no position to play a trumpet recital at that point. I was in the middle of this embouchure change. And so I went to the dean and I said, look, I know this sounds crazy, but I want to study musicology and I want to do early music. Could I play my recital on the recorder? And he said, well, yeah, it sounds okay to me. I've heard you play, you're very talented, and I know that's what you wanted to do. But you'll have to get the entire brass faculty sign off on that, which meant at that point going around to Charlie Gorham and Louis Davidson and Phil Farkas and Harvey Phillips and all of these names that were legends to me, and saying, hi, I'm a trumpet student here and I'd like to do my recital on the recorder. Imagine. And they all agreed. They all signed off on it, which was incredible. And then, so I played a recital on recorder, and I was very happy. I thought I did very well. And a few days later, I got a note in my box from, of all people, the carillon teacher at Indiana University, Ari Abenez, who I later found out was a very eminent carillonneur in Holland. And he called me to his office and he said, I heard your recital and you played very well. I was very impressed, but you play the recorder like a modern instrument. And you need to go to Europe and see the whole world that's going on there in early music, and absorb this whole cultural movement and discover what it means to play old music. Well, I left his office thinking, I was feeling kind of upset and insulted, but he'd planted a seed, I have to say, which made me think. And then in the next year or so, I went and did a workshop with Franz Bruggen in Berkeley, and I played for him Canzona Frescobaldi for soprano solo on the soprano recorder. And he listened and said, well, that's very nice, play very well, but you have to try to imagine what it would sound like to hear that played on a cornetto. There's nobody today who can do that, but that's what you need to imagine. And that was like fertilizing the seed that had already been planted.
La mío para que me traduzca un poco.
Sorry?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
I think that was Carlos. I'm muting Carlos. That was probably not intentional.
Or Gustavo, maybe, but I don't. Okay, anyway. So I had then decided to go off to Europe, as had been suggested to me. I studied the recorder. I went to Basel. I had a cornetto in my backpack, a newly purchased Christopher Monk resin cornetto, which I had not even played yet. I was really serious about studying the recorder. And probably some of you have heard this story because it's become kind of legendary. In my first semester as a recorder student, I had an accident and I broke my wrist, my right wrist, and I couldn't play the recorder. And I was sitting in my room thinking, what am I going to do, having saved money to come here? And I saw the cornetto hanging on the wall, and I thought, well, it doesn't have any hole for the little finger. I probably could cover the holes. And so for 2 months, while I had this cast on my arm, I would rest the bell of the instrument on my knee and the cast on a table, and I could just play a little bit. I didn't make huge progress. But what the miracle was, when they took the cast off, suddenly the instrument just fell into my hands, and it was so easy to hold. And that's one of the hardest things that any of you who play the cornetto know, that first impact with the cornetto is a lot to do with learning how to comfortably hold the instrument with relaxed fingers and stability. And that was all taken care of automatically by this accident. And in that next period of a few months, I had an experience I've never had anywhere else, that each day I could play something that I couldn't play the day before. It was all these things were coming together: my trumpet experience, my embouchure training, my fingers from the recorder, my tongue, my knowledge of the repertoire and style and things, and it just all came together. So that was in 1974, 74, 75. The next year, Edward Tarr, who was teaching me cornetto, said, why don't you take over the cornetto class and I'll just teach trumpet. And so that was the beginning of my 40 years of teaching in Basel. And the following year, Jordi Savall said, wouldn't you like to play some things with Hesperian 20? And that was it. That was the beginning of it all. I don't want to give short shrift to Edward Tarr, because he was, at that time, his generation of cornetto players were really playing on trumpet equipment with big mouthpieces, trumpet-sized mouthpieces, and doing more or less well what you can do with that kind of equipment. But he had the perspicuity to see that was not the future of the cornetto, and to see that what I was doing was something entirely different. And so he helped me a lot with looking at repertoire and instruments and things, gave me a start. But then after that, our paths more or less separated.
So wonderful, wonderful lead up to this point. In fact, I didn't even really know, I don't know, when did the Schola Cantorum start? It must have been before you
Oh,
got there.
oh
So,
my God, yes. The Schola was founded in the 1930s by Paul Zacher. And it, it kind of came out of this whole house music idea in the German-speaking countries during the war, and it had its first big boom in the 1950s when people like Gustav Leonhardt were there studying, and well, many others, August Wenzinger, and it had another sort of rebirth in the years just before I went there, because I got a new director, Peter Reidemeister, and they had Tom Binkley there with the studio, therefore in Musik. There was this big influx of foreigners, Americans especially, doing medieval music, like Ben Bagby and Barbara Thornton and my wife, Candace Smith. And so there was a kind of second rebirth in that period, though not without a sense of tension between the American students of medieval music and the German students predominantly studying Baroque music.
wow.
But nevertheless, it was.
I took a course from Thomas Binkley when I was at Indiana, and I remember him. He didn't really care what I played. I could play trumpet or cornetto or whatever in his class. It was about Renaissance style. And I remember him walking by my practice room once, and he opened the door and he came in and asked me to play. And I said, well, I'm trying to work on these articulations, and you'll talk about this probably later on in our conversation. But he had an interesting thing to say, and I would be curious what you have to say about it. He said, well, these were Italians who were writing about the tiri tiri and liri liri and so forth. And he says, but you're American, so you could possibly just think about your own language and try to put in your own American English syllables into the words and see what happens. And so I tried that. I thought it was an interesting idea. I don't know if it was exactly what you would recommend, but I thought he was a very innovative and creative thinker.
Yes, he was, of course, innovative and creative, and stimulating. Also enigmatic and obscure, intentionally obscure sometimes. I think that, and I always found that things that he had to say, they always had a kernel of truth about them, but a lot of other stuff. I think that's the case here. I don't want to get bogged down on that subject right now, because I do want to talk about articulation and historical syllables and all of that in a good time here.
I wonder if we can talk a little bit about maybe forming the Concerto Palatino.
Yeah, that's good. But that has a little pre-history,
yes.
which is that our founding, we meaning me and Charles Toot, our foundation of Concerto Palatino grew out of our work, first my work and then our work together with Hesperian 20 and Jordi Savall, because in 1978, Jordi asked me to put together a cornet and sackbut ensemble to play with Hesperian 20. And I had never played in a cornet and sackbut ensemble. In fact, I had almost never played with anyone who played cornetto or sackbut up to that point. I had only been playing for 3 years. And so I said, sure, that would be great. And I called the people I knew, who were Charles Toot, sackbut from The Hague, and Jean-Pierre Cagnac, whom I had met the year before on cornetto, and we had the late Dick Lister, played bass trombone, came down from Cologne, and we had a series of alto, tenor, trombonists, various different people. But I put together in '78. I put together this ensemble of 2 cornetti and 3 trombones, and we began a series of 14 recordings with Jordi over the course of 10, 11 years from '78. And I thought I would just play a little sound. I want to play some samples because I think it's interesting to hear in many respects. I want to play a little sample of our first recording with Hesperian 20, which was the Samuel Scheidt Ludi Musici. Those pieces that I'm sure all of you or most of you know very well. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here. Hopefully this will all go smoothly. Share sound. So the piece that I want to play is Canzon Cornetto, which is kind of an iconic piece. I'm sure many of you know it. It's a piece for 4 cornetti and organ. It has no bass part. It's just a basso seguente. The organ plays the bottom cornetto part. So it's all very high. And there's an anecdote about this I have to say, because Jordi, when he plays the viol, first of all, we couldn't do it with 4 cornetti because I didn't know 4 cornetto players in those days. So we did the piece with 2 cornetti and 2 treble viols. And Jordi, when he plays the viol, when he's very involved in the music, he begins to sort of, I will have to say, grunt. And that's normally covered up by the bass line, the bass instruments, but there is no bass in the Canzon Cornetto, so it was very audible. And the recording engineer had to keep stopping us, saying, we have to do something about this noise. And so Jordi ended up putting a piece of chamois cloth around his face. He looked like the Lone Ranger or something, which sort of masked that sound. But the trouble was that Jean-Pierre and I, every time we would look over at him, we would start laughing and have to restart. So that was kind of an interesting moment. So here I'm going to play a little bit of this Canzon Cornetto, just so that you can hear that way back in 1978, it was not the Stone Age for the cornetto, I think. I'm quite happy with the way this sounds. Oops, I have to go into, all right. So I want to ask if we're all able to hear that, because we were.
Yes, it was perfect for me.
Okay. Right. So I want to, well, as I said, we went on and made 14 recordings with Hesperian, and it was quite an exciting time. We did a lot of touring and played in wonderful concert halls and with wonderful musicians. But it wasn't always easy, because Jordi is a very strong-minded man. He's always very, very friendly and nice, but his also quite chaotic the way he rehearses and records, and sometimes rehearsals were endless and recording sessions were endless. And one of our last recordings was The Art of Fugue. And this was a case where Jordi had this idea. He wanted to do The Art of Fugue with 4 viols and 4 wind instruments. And he wanted the wind instruments to be cornetto, oboe da caccia, trombone, and bassoon. Well, when he told me that, I said, Jordi, this is crazy. Those instruments would never have played together. It's certainly not in this kind of music. And what are you going to do about the pitch? Because the oboe da caccia and the bassoon are going to be in 415, and the cornet and the trombone are in 440. In those days, we didn't have other choices. And so he had an oboe da caccia and a bassoon constructed in 440, Baroque bassoon in 440. And we proceeded to make this recording, and an incredible series of concerts all across Europe in all the most important concert halls of the Musikverein Saal in Vienna, and the Wigmore Hall, and the Philharmonie in Berlin. And it turned out to be one of the most exciting musical experiences of my career. It was just so amazing to play this music with these musicians. I still think it's all wrong. I don't think it ever would have been played this way, but I can listen to this recording with great pleasure. I'd like to play a bit of Contrapunctus 1 for you. I'll stop it there. You can listen to the rest on YouTube or Spotify or whatever. Now, as audacious as it was to play that music on these instruments, Jordi also wanted to play not just the 4-part contrapunti, but also the canons, the 3-part canons with wind and string instruments. And so here's one of the most audacious ones, the Contrapunctus 13A. And when he showed me the music for that, I said, no, Jordi, this is not wind music. We can't play this. It's a kind of common refrain. And it turned out to be a wonderful thing to play. I'll just play a minute of this. Okay, enough of that. So around this time, about 1987, certain frustrations began to bubble over. I mean, in this period, I was doing most of my work with either Jordi Savall or Andrew Parrott. And they were sort of polar opposites. And I say this with enormous respect for both of them, but especially for Andrew Parrott, because Andrew always wanted to have all the prerequisites right. He wanted to have the right instrumentation and the right players for the right instruments, and all of the historical issues dealt with. And then you would only have 10 minutes to rehearse. Jordi, on the other hand, wouldn't care about all of the historical issues. He had quite an amazing intuition, and he relied on that, and on the fact that he would have 36 hours of rehearsal time for the same thing that we did in 10 minutes with Andrew Parrott. After 10 years of that, Charles and I both felt frustrated that we wanted to have both of those things come together in one group and be able to make our own decisions about these things. And so we formed this group, Concerto Palatino, after a few wrong turns about finding a name for the group. We hit on Concerto Palatino, which is a short version of Il Concerto Palatino della Signoria di Bologna, which was a historical ensemble of 4 cornetti and 4 trombones that existed for 300 years in Bologna. And for our first recording, we wanted to focus on the repertoire of that original group. So music for 4 cornetti and 4 trombones. And I think it's one of our most successful recordings, musically successful, not probably commercially. But I want to play a couple of brief excerpts from this. And this first piece, of course, the Concerto Palatino, with that instrumentation that they had, and having the duty to play sometimes in San Petronio, where we have these wonderful opposing organ lofts and opposing organs, it would be a natural thing for them to play double choir music. None of the repertoire of the Concerto Palatino survives, except one piece in manuscript from the mid or late 17th century. So you have to sort of extrapolate what they might have played. Here's a bit of an 8-part sonata by Cesario Gussago, with a little bit of improvisation on the top parts by Doran Sherwin and me. Oops, I have to do it this way. For the curious, the cornetti on that recording were me and Doran Sherwin, Jean Toubery, and William Dongua. Both William and Jean had just finished their studies with me at the time, and Doran a bit earlier. A lot of what we did with Concerto Palatino was vocal music. Every time we did a concert or recording of only instrumental music, we would always include some vocal pieces, some motets played instrumentally, because it's such an important part of the of learning to play stylistically any music from that period. Having a text, imitating the text. I want to talk about that more in detail in a moment. But so one of our favorite composers was Ascanio Trombetti, who was also known as Ascanio del Cornetto. This gentleman here. I love this portrait because it looks like he's just beckoning to us and saying, hey, have a look at my mouthpiece. Let me hear you listen to this lick. It's just so intense. So he was a wonderful composer, and here's a motet, an 8-part motet of his. Okay, we'll stop there. And I'm going to forego the Gabriele Sonata because I want to have time to talk about some other things. I'm going to stop sharing for the moment. Oops.
I'm going to say really quickly here that Bruce, you have a wonderful collection of iconography of the cornet back in the day on your website. I think it's still on your website. And I would love for people to explore that if they haven't already and see some of the wonderful images that you've collected over the years.
Yeah, in fact, that ties in very well to the next thing I wanted to talk about. What you wrote in your list of questions about cornetto research and what role that has played in my career. And I think, I don't think you can be a cornetto player in the 21st century and not be interested in research in some sense, because you don't have much given to you. You have to discover everything. And I always felt as a teacher, I didn't also want to teach the cornetto like a conservatory teacher where there's a whole lineage of teachers that are passing on a playing tradition, and I want my students to play like me. No, I wanted to encourage all of my students to discover their own way. And I think I'm satisfied when they play very well, but play in different ways, because there's so much that we still don't understand. And there used to be this idea of this figure of the performer scholar who would embody both these worlds. I think that the person who comes closest to that for me, for my taste, is Andrew Parrott. But I do think that in the end, everyone is either a performer or a scholar, because the goals are so different. The scholar has to find truth, and if you can't find it, you have to say, I can't find it. The performer has to take the information that's available to him and construct his own truth. And you can't stand on stage and say, I don't know what this is supposed to sound like. So the goals are kind of go against each other. And I think most people fall more comfortably into one or the other, and I certainly feel more comfortable in the performer role. So research for me was always a part of the process of trying to reconstruct this picture of what was going on in the 16th and 17th centuries. Um, I've always, my dream would always have been to go back to St. Mark's in Venice in 1610 or 1608 and just listen for 20 minutes. And I've always been convinced that if you could do that, it would be so confusing and maybe baffling and annoying that we wouldn't know what to make of it, but it would be satisfy some kind of craving. And so I felt like my whole life has been trying to find ways. I think of it as puzzle pieces that go together to form this picture of what would have been there, or peepholes into into this world. And they can be of all different things. We call them access points to this world. And for me, the activity of research has been trying to satisfy this curiosity, as well as finding repertoire to play. But it is the thing, these little pieces of information, this little contact with that world are the things that have kept me motivated the whole 50 years or 45 years of my playing career. I don't think you can find that kind of motivation in how can I make a program that I can easily sell on social media and the festival directors will buy it. And I mean, that sort of thing becomes tiresome. So I tried to instill in my students always this same kind of curiosity. And how do you do that? Well, I think that the access points that are most important are a whole variety of things, which I'm going to share my screen again because I have a bunch of pictures of things that of the sort that I mean. Here's a little, in a way, kind of trivial example, although it's not really trivial. This is a signature of a cornetto player, Paolo Antonio Gongini, 1575, carved into the case of the organ in San Petronio, in the Lorenzo da Prato organ, which is from 1490 something. And for me, seeing that and standing there in that space and touching this signature and imagining what this player was thinking and feeling when he was there, probably waiting for his time to go out in the mass and play a piece with the organ, just makes me feel so much in touch with these people who we can't understand in so many ways, but that is something we can connect with. Of course, much more important than that are museum instruments, surviving cornetti, of which there are some 380. And they are a source of information about pitch, about fingerings, about sound. But they are also just items that, if you take them in your hands, make you feel linked to this world that we're trying to not recreate, but enter into. And I always feel one of the reasons I'm in Bologna is that I feel so close to so many of these kinds of things. When I'm in Indiana, where I grew up, sometimes I ask myself, what am I doing playing the cornetto? What does this instrument mean? What is the sense of doing that in the 21st century? But if you're in Bologna and you can go into the Accademia Filarmonica and see these instruments, or go into a church and see frescoes of this instrument or organs. So anyway, this was also very much an important part of my teaching in Basel, always to travel with the students to museums, hopefully ones that allow you to play, which became more and more difficult. Churches with historical organs. Here you see the famous Bendinelli trumpet and the Bendinelli trumpet method in the hands of a student. Have a look at that mouthpiece if you are a trumpet player.
It's an enormous mouthpiece, probably
Yes.
22 millimeters on inner diameter, something like that.
Yeah. And here's a nice close-up of the brass on that trumpet. Some of the books, this is in the Accademia Filarmonica of Verona, books on music and books of music. The most beautiful no smoking sign in the world. Here we are in the Accademia Filarmonica in Bologna, looking at a very beautiful, but unfortunately incomplete cornetto. And here's Paolo Fanciullacci, master cornetto maker, studying one of the cornetti in Rome, which he then copied very beautifully. Here we are in Kromezic, looking at 17th century scores and parts with a group of students. And here's here we are in Krakow, Poland, doing the same. In Bologna at the Museo Civico. I'm sure you recognize some of these people. This is the archives of San Petronio in Bologna. And here's one of their holdings, the Concerti di Andrea and Giovanni Gabrieli from 1587. But, you know, I think these things, it's important, if you can possibly manage it, to hold them in your hands. It doesn't, looking at the digital image just isn't the same thing as feeling the texture of the paper, smelling the paper and the ink, and getting a sense of how big these things were and how musicians would have used them. And it really makes you feel different about this whole world. And then, of course, organs, a whole series of beautiful Renaissance 16th and 15th century organs in Bologna and other places, which we always went to play with. This one is in Bologna. It's the organ that was played by Adriano Banchieri. And here we are with students on the organ loft playing. Here's in Mantova at Santa Barbara. And near Bergamo, this is an organ in 440 mean tone, whereas Mantova is 462, and San Michele in Bosco is 440. This is in Valvasone near Venice, an organ, beautiful organ in 492 mean tone, an organ that is almost identical in its registration to the organ that was in San Marco in Venice at the time that Gabrieli was there. So you can go here and hear the organ, play with it, and then go to San Marco where the organ no longer exists and hear the acoustic, which is what we are doing here in Piazza San Marco, and then playing from the organ loft in San Marco with an 18th century organ in a 20th century case.
Well, Bruce, I have, of course, a few trumpet students who don't know much about playing the cornetto on this, and maybe some other people will watch it later on. So when you're trying to perform with these organs, they have different pitch centers. So what is the process? Tell me about how do you adapt as a cornetto player?
Well, you adapt by having instruments in different pitches and transposing combination of the two.
One second, I'm going to mute. I think that's it. Good.
And this is something that became more and more a part of the cornetto class in Basel as the years went by. And we started out back in 1981 in 440, of course, because the only instruments we could get our hands on were in 440. And over the years, that has changed. Pitches have gone up and up. We managed about 15 years ago or 10 years ago to move the sort of standard pitch of the cornetto class to 466, which is a half step above 440, so that 440 becomes a specialty pitch for certain repertoire or certain necessary situations. But the basic pitch is 466. And then in the last 5-6 years of my teaching there, we were getting much more acquainted with higher pitches. 492, which is another half step above 440, it's a half step above 466. So we have a series of half steps, and then even 522. 522, there's not much evidence really, I think, for instruments at 522, but I love my 522 instrument of Paolo Fanciulacci, and I tend to use it as often as a cornettino at a very low pitch, because, well, I think I should back up a little bit and say, pitch was a local. This is a half truth. I'll be Tom Binkley here for a moment. Pitch was a local matter. I mean, each church organ had its own pitch, and sometimes it was a pitch that was sort of unified over a city or a region. There are kind of generalizations you can make about pitch, that in the south of Italy, the pitch was much lower, and in the north of Italy, the pitch was highest in Italy. And the other thing to know is that there were, in the 17th century and 18th century, there were two pitches. There was what was called cornet tone or core tone, which was the high pitch, and kammer tone, which was a whole step lower. Because you had, in the 16th century, the pitch was high, half step above 440. And then in the 17th century, these new Baroque instruments started to be imported from France, the Baroque oboe and the transverse flute and the Baroque bassoon, and they were at 415, or not, generalizing a bit, but they basically were at something around 415, a whole step below the cornetti and the trombones and the dulcians and the instruments that were left over from the 16th century. And so those, that was a workable thing, that whole step difference between core tone and kammer tone, because they could transpose. And that's in fact what cornetto players did mostly in the late 17th and in the 18th centuries. They transposed down a step to be in the pitch of the strings and everything else. So it's a complicated, messy subject, because there were no standardizations, but 466 was, as much as existed, a standard pitch for cornetti. Sometimes it was 470 or 473, or it could vary, but high. But there were higher pitches, and you find organs in northern Italy now which have been restored to their original pitches and are at pitches like 492. That one I showed you from Valvasone near Venice is an original organ at 492. I was told by the organist in San Marco in Venice that the original organs there were at 522. I don't know if I believe him entirely, but if you're a cornetto player, you learn to love these high pitches, because the cornetto is an instrument, as opposed to the bassoon, which almost up to a certain limit, the higher it is, the better it works. So a 466 or a 492 cornetto just simply functions better than a 440 cornetto. And not to speak of 415, they never used 415 cornetti. So I don't know, is that clear enough?
That really helps out a lot. And when we were talking last week, I don't know where it comes in hopefully your presentation, but I think you had some examples of how to perform something you had to basically transpose and so forth.
Yeah, I will do that. I will end with that.
Wonderful.
But I would like to get into something which I think is the most important thing we could talk about here, which is the question of, well, you put it in your question, what were the insights you learned from your teaching in Basel, or what were the themes that you pursued in your teaching? And I would like to reframe that a little bit, and I would say that the thing that I, above all, wanted to impart to my students. And these are things that are not just me imparting something to my students, but things that came out of the encounter between me and students between themselves, working together to find ways to make these things work. And that is the subject of instrumental vocality. What does it mean to imitate the human voice on the cornetto? And it involves a whole series of things, because the last thing that it means, or the thing that it doesn't mean at all, is playing in a cantabile way, singing in a legato way. No, it's the opposite of that, almost the opposite of that. It's playing in such a way that your notes that you play sound like words and sound like syllables. And that involves articulation, but it also involves shaping of notes, onset and development of notes, and all different kinds of accents. You know, people talk about historical tonguings, and we have the famous lingue, terra terra, which you were referring to, Stanley, earlier. Terra 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 terra, terra lera 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 lera, teka 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 teka. Those were the three lingue. They're pretty much described in the same way by all the sources. But what people often don't understand is that those lingue were designed to imitate vocal melismatic articulation, division singing. Oh, the things where there are no syllables, you know, fast notes articulated in the throat, in the gorgia, the throat, which is why it's called, one of them, the one that was most popular for playing divisions, was called lingua di gorgia, because it's the tonguing of divisions. And now we can talk about these three tonguings and what they mean, and perhaps we should a little bit, but I don't want to get too bogged down in that, because I don't think it's the most important thing. I think the most important thing is, how do you shape notes to make them sound like words? Because words don't just have accented and unaccented syllables. It's not binary, black and white. Words have all kinds of accents. They have accents that are at the onset of the note, or the syllable, or that grow through the syllable. For example, if I say caro dolce ben mio, caro has the accent on the first syllable, but it isn't a caro. It isn't a brutal accent. It's a soft accent. Caro dolce ben mio, perché fuggire? And then have totally different kind of accents. So those are the things that you need to learn from playing music, vocal music, and playing music next to singers. And it isn't that the lingue, terra, lera, teka, teka, imitated syllables. I mean, most of these writers like Bassano, Dalla Casa, they say when you have eighth notes or slower to play, you tongue them all ta, 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 ta. And we think, oh, how horrible is that? You know, it's how boring. But it's not ta 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 ta. It's ta 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 ta. And you need to have that clarity of articulation. If you play ta ra la ra ta ra ta ra la in a church, it will just sound like a mess. So single tonguing, yes, but in a way that respects or tries to imitate the way in which words shape notes and link them in groups of 2 and 3. That's all very much more important than terra 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 lera. Now, about your question, Stanley, about terra terra, because I think personally, for me, terra 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 has been the most important tonguing for my playing. Because it is so controllable in speed. It can be slow, it can be fast, it can be almost as fast as teka teka teka, tera 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 ta, or diddle 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 diddle. Tera 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 ta. But tara 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 only works as a double tongue if you make the r stroke a passive stroke. It's a reaction to the t stroke. Tara, 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 tara. That's not ta da ta da ta da ta da ta. If you play ta da ta da ta da ta da ta da, it's single tonguing that has a slight alteration of different sounds. But tara 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 is a double tongue in the same way that teka 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 is a double tongue. And so I always spent a lot of time with my students trying to develop a fast tara 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 tonguing. And some had an easier time depending on the language they spoke. Here's where your question comes in. The problems of language came more often to play in the terra lera lera tonguing, which I'm convinced is an Italian way of writing diddle 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 diddle. So terra lera lera diddle 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 diddle. I could spend an hour talking about that, but that's just my opinion that terra lera lera is the Italian equivalent of diddle diddle diddle. And most French people find that impossible. Mais diddle diddle diddle. And they found it impossible in the 18th century, and therefore all the flute tutors say you should play fast notes with dugu 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 dugu, while the Germans were all saying diddle diddle diddle, and the English were all saying tootle tootle tootle, and the Italians, I guess, terra lera lera in some way. So language does play a role, but you can't just say, okay, I say terry terry terry, and I'm going to tongue like that, because it won't work. In order to make these tonguings work, but especially in order to make this business of shaping notes to sound like syllables, in order to make that work, you have to have a very light, flexible airflow at very low pressure. And so I think that's one of the most important things in playing the cornetto, is to always be playing with the least possible air pressure. And that is a thing that is very difficult for trumpet players who come to the cornetto, because they bring along their habits of air pressure and air speed. And it makes it very hard to shape notes. I had an experience a few years ago working for 3 days with the entire brass section of the Munich Philharmonic, whatever the name of the orchestra was. 23 brass players, wonderful modern brass players, working on Gabriele Canzona for a project that they were supposed to do. And they were amazing, but I was very interested to see what they found difficult. And one of the things that trumpet players found most difficult was to deal with the way notes develop and decay, because they had never been taught to care about anything after the attack. Da, da, da. And if you listen, I want to quickly go into share. I want to play you with something that you've probably all heard, or many of you. I think it's very instructive. Oh, what's this? Wait. Go back to here. Yes. I'm sure you've seen this recording. The Philadelphia, Cleveland, and Chicago brass ensembles playing.
Bruce, we still can't see quite yet what your presentation. I'm looking at your web browser.
Oh, okay. I'm going to stop sharing and try sharing again. And share. Okay. I think this will do it. Now, can you?
I see your Finder.
I'm going to close this application. I'll get back into it. And share my screen. Do you see anything now? No.
I don't think you're sharing your screen yet.
Okay. Keynote interview, Stan, here.
Okay, that's it. That's it.
Okay, so now we move on to this. This recording, which I'm sure I grew up with this recording, and you all did, and of course, wonderful brass players. But listen to their approach to articulation and shaping of notes. Okay, now, no words go ta 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 ta. I'd like you to listen to this recording of the same piece by a group of Japanese high school girls. Okay, I don't know what you all think of that, but I think it's just extraordinary. They could go further in the vocality, but they have the feeling, they understand. Now, I understand also that modern brass players have gone a bit beyond that recording from 1957 or 63 or whenever it was. But still, I found the same thing when I worked with these brass players in Munich, that they didn't have a sense of how to make the breath shape the notes in a vocal way. And I don't know how long I can go on here, but I do have a few examples I want to show you of pieces, specific pieces where, or you can look at the music on the screen and listen to a recording, and for the same idea of how to imitate words in playing. So I'll go back into my, if I get to the point where I have to stop, just scream, stop.
No, I think we should go on because it's just so, we're getting to the good parts now.
Yeah, exactly. So I hope this works again now to get back into my, oh no, what's going on here? Share screen. Oh, don't see. There's always something new that happens with Zoom, I find. I'm going to close that. Keynote. Open it back up. Now I'm going to share the screen again. You see that?
Yes.
Okay. So here is a piece, a madrigal of Andrea Gabrieli, Caro dolce ben mio, with divisions by Giovanni Bassano. And I've just highlighted a few words so you can see how the articulation of the phrasing is adapted to the words. So we have this caro dolce ben mio, perché fuggire? Why do you run away? And then again, caro dolce, perché fuggire? And then later on we have the word languisce, more, languish and die, where both the meaning of the word and the sound of the word change the way of articulating the music. So I'll play this. Okay, now a few years ago, I met this wonderful soprano, Hanna Blazikova, and the first time I heard her sing, I thought, this is the most cornetto-friendly voice I've ever heard. And so we've embarked on a series of recordings, and it has taught me a lot about imitating the voice. Here is a piece with two sopranos where I'm playing the second soprano and she's singing first. And I'm trying to imitate exactly how her words influence the shaping of the notes. Oh, wait, I have to do this differently or we won't be able to go to the second page. All right. Okay. Okay. Well, I would like to show another example where it's an ensemble of 12, 6 singers and 6 instruments, where the goal, again, is to imitate the words. The goal is really to make the ensemble sound like it is pronouncing the words, and you can't quite tell always which is an instrument and which is a voice. So just have a little listen to this. Um, let's leave it there. Here you see an array of cornetti that go from 440 on the left, 2 instruments in 466, then a 492, a 520, and then a cornettino. And what Stanley was referring to before was, well, no, actually not this piece. This is just a brief excerpt of an aria of Bononcini where I'm playing the 522 instrument as a cornettino. And we'll end with this example, and then if there's time, we can have some questions. This is an aria of Scarlatti, Alessandro Scarlatti, where it's originally a cornetto part, you see, but the cornetto part goes up to quite a number of high E's, which is an indication to me that the pitch was in Naples, where this was written, was probably very low, probably 392. And the cornetto player would have transposed down. So we've transposed the entire piece down a step because it fit better for Hannah to sing. And I'm playing the cornetto in 492, transposing down a minor third so that I'm fingering a B on the first note, but it sounds D. I know it's very confusing, but I hope that it's clear. Okay, then we have da capo. So that's what I have to present. Are there questions? Do we have time for questions? I'd be happy to.
Yeah, we should definitely open up for some questions, and we'll take as many as seems like it would work.
Okay.
So is anybody there? You can unmute if, or maybe I'm going to go, I can't really see everybody with the view I have, so I'm going to switch to the gallery view. Does anybody want to raise their hand to ask a question?
Yes, sir. My name is Martin Long from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'm an accomplished orchestral player. How would you, Professor Dickey, thank you so much for your splendid preparation and a lecture and recital here. May I get your thoughts on how to prepare for cornetto playing? I have fleshy and thick lips, and I play a large-sized mouthpiece.
Okay.
And I can't play the little guys, the little what are referred to as acorns in size.
Okay. I'm not sure that I would exclude that because you have fleshy lips. I mean, you don't have to fit your lips into the mouthpiece. You know, I of course I play a very small mouthpiece, and I realize that not everyone can play such a small one, but I do think that mouthpieces that are in the general area of the size of a trumpet mouthpiece are going to simply make the instrument very difficult to play with any kind of agility and freedom. So I think you should rethink how you could fit a small mouthpiece onto your, as you say, fleshy lips without thinking of tucking the lips into the mouthpiece, but just simply forming your embouchure the way you do on the trumpet and placing this cornetto mouthpiece on it. Now that's a very complicated thing to try to explain over with this medium, but I think it warrants more experimentation, because I have had students with very fleshy lips who managed perfectly well, and I have not had a single trumpet student who came to me and was able to play satisfactorily on a large mouthpiece. Of course, large and small are relative terms, but within the definition of, I don't like the term acorn very well, because that sort of grew up in a time when we didn't know that much about mouthpieces, but small-ish mouthpieces that have a volume that will allow the instrument to resonate and speak. I don't think that's out of the question for anyone, their lips.
One last follow-up, sir. Are you still talking about Ansetzen rather than Einsetzen?
Yeah. Yes. Sure. Especially in the upper lip. You know, what you do with your bottom lip can vary more, but on the upper lip, you need to have it sitting on the lip, more or less in the same place where you place your trumpet mouthpiece, I think.
Lastly, could you recommend an instrument or a crafts maker of cornetti, please?
Yeah. Well, there are various possibilities now. There are a lot of makers, There are half a dozen excellent makers now in North America and in Europe. So I can mention a few names. I don't know how helpful that will be, but Matthew Genejan in Montreal, and Paolo Fanciulacci in Prato, Serge Delmas in Paris, Damien Bardonnet in Lyon, and then there are some newer makers, Andrew Halleck in Holland, and Sam Goebel. And then there is, of course, Ricardo Simian in Basel, who is making, he's not the only one doing this, but the one most successfully perhaps doing this, making 3D printed cornetti, which are quite acceptable.
Say that name again, sir, please.
Ricardo Simian. He has a company called 3D Instruments, or 3D Musical Instruments. You can find his website.
Yeah.
Grazie.
Okay, prego.
So we have a question on the chat greetings from Prague. This is from Andre.
Yeah.
And he says, may I ask about the performance of polychoral music in San Mark's in Venetia?
Yes.
And I've read some of the contradictory remarks. Were there really separate instrumental choirs positioned in the organ lofts? What about the wooden platforms raised for the performance at the welcome ceremony of Japanese princesses and envoys around 1585? Do we
Yeah.
know where they stood? Thank you for this question. All the best.
Okay, it's a complicated question. It is certainly they played double choir music with instruments in St. Mark's, but there are a lot of misconceptions about that. I mean, we used to think that all of these cori spezzati pieces, all of these double choir motets of Villard and Andrea Gabrieli, that they were performed with separate choirs. In fact, much of that music was performed with only singers down on the floor on certain kinds of feast days. So, but on major feast days when solo singers and instrumentalists were present, and on which occasions they often did construct wooden platforms, still the standard way of setting up was to have the ripieno singers, the choir, if you like, but I think that's a misleading term, in the octagonal pulpit, which stands in front of the rood screen. You see this raised pulpit, and the singers all stood in that. 8 or 10 of them stood in that pulpit, or in some occasions on the stairway leading into the choir. And that's where the Maestro de Capella was making his tactus movements. Then the instrumentalists, if there were them, were in the opposing organ lofts, and Giovanni Bassano was standing on the left side and watching the Maestro di Capella, Zarlino or whoever it was, and then passing the beat across to the players on the other side. Players and singers. There might have been solo singers. It could be a choir with one singer and 3 instruments, or or 4 singers and 4 instruments. Various possibilities. And then there are these little so-called niches that are adjacent to the choir lofts, where there's room for 1 or 2 people, perhaps a theorbo and a solo singer, if it's that kind of music. So the main places were the 2 organ lofts, the octagonal pulpit downstairs or the main floor, and these niches. And then on special occasions when they had lots of players and singers, they would build wooden platforms. That's certainly was the case on that visit of the Japanese princes, I think. Okay.
Any other questions?
And I would have to say we've experimented this in San Marco with standing there and passing the beat across, and we even had on one occasion the conductor down in the octagonal pulpit, and it's absolutely easy to be together. There's no problem whatsoever. It's not far, and the acoustic is incredibly clear. Okay.
One more question, Professor
Martin,
Dickey.
hey, Martin, why don't we go to somebody else, give somebody else another chance to ask a question? We have Michael Mullen, who's raised his hand.
Can't hear you. I think he must be muted.
Michael, can you unmute? Maybe I can unmute you. Michael.
There.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Greetings all, and greetings from London. I just wanted to ask you, Bruce, to what extent is there a lot of other original material out there in Italy in various church
absolutely
basements and stuff?
Absolutely endless. Well, in Italy, but even more so in Germany and in Poland, the Czech Republic, Moravia. I recently discovered, I wanted to talk about this. I recently spent some time in Brno in Moravia, because I was there. I knew about the collection in Kromezic and had been there 3 times and was there with students. But on a tip a couple of years ago, discovered that there's an enormous trove of music in Brno from the 18th century, pieces of amazing music with cornetti, very often one cornet and two trombones, occasionally two cornetti and two trombones. But even in the second half of the 18th century, the tradition went on for a long, long time. And I've copied a lot of music there and scored some, and will be performing a very important mass in Basel in September that was transcribed from that collection. But I mean, that's just one example. There's just an endless amount of music for our instruments, especially if you're talking about polychoral, large-scale music. There's just no end of it.
We have a question from Gabriel Cordero. He's been having his hand raised up.
I know I was getting a little tired. Hi, Bruce. I'm in New York. My name's Gabriel. I've been learning cornet for the past 1.5 years or so. I started off in modern trumpet, and I've slowly been transitioning backwards.
Yes.
And I guess my question more pertains to the technical aspect of learning the instrument. In like when you're developing dexterity, like your finger dexterity, how would you teach that to someone, or what would you recommend for having the fingers move faster, especially when it comes to quick diminutions and such? I feel like with my armature and tongue placements and such, like things like that, I have a pretty good grasp. Just because, and I've made the adjustment pretty well to the smaller mouthpiece. So my tone quality is there, but it's really the fingers that I've been struggling with.
Did you ever play recorder?
Not on a serious level, I guess. The level that you do in America in the 3rd grade with little karate belts.
Yes. I mean, that could be helpful. I mean, that's how I learned. The first thing I did learning the finger dexterity was to play recorder, but you have to really be serious about it and practice it. That's one thing. I would say another thing is the most important thing is finding a way of holding the instrument which is comfortable. And it's never going to be incredibly natural. It's not going to look to someone else like, oh, that looks easy. Look at paintings and engravings of cornetto players, and they're always going through contortions. But as I was taught by a very dear man, Pat O'Brien, who died a number of years ago, a lute player, but an expert in all of these kinds of issues of tendons and muscles and things. And he said, he looked at my hand positions, and I said, well, does this look tense to you? And he said, no, your fingers are stretched, and that's okay as long as you don't put tension on them. So you can have your hands in a kind of contorted position as long as you don't then add tension to it. So they have to be relaxed. And now it would be easier to show you in person because there are different approaches to the finger position on cornetto. Some players have the fingers more or less like recorder players, coming straight on. You can't see your hands coming straight on like this, and other players are much more like a transverse flute. That's my approach. Some of those who came more intensely from the recorder, like Jean Tubery, plays more like a recorder player, and I found this. But the main thing is you have to find a way of holding the instrument, even when all the finger holes are open, that is stable with relaxed fingers. And that takes work and experimentation to find that. We are handicapped by our reliance on 440 instruments, because that is vastly easier at 466. And I could say to you, move to a 466 cornetto. But the trouble is, for most people, that's not practical, because their first gigs are going to be at 440, almost inevitably. or at least a mixture, but it's not likely that you're going to be able to say, oh, I only play at 466 in today's world at the level of someone who's just getting started. So you have to deal with that. And I don't know, I could show you some tricks if we were in the same room, the same country, the same city. But maybe you can get together with someone in North America who plays well. Nathaniel Cox, I don't know if you know him, or Kiri Tolakson, Alex Opsal. There are others, but
no, thank you. Like what you said about the difference between the 440 instrument and the 466 instrument. I've definitely had a lot of ease with my 466 instrument in fingering.
Well, I have to say that I had more ease with my 440 instrument before I started spending a lot of time at 466 and 492 and 522. And now I go back to my 440 instrument and I think, how did I do this? How did I manage to hold this thing? I have to break my wrist all over again to make it work.
Oh, thank you so much.
Sure, sure.
We have Allison with a question.
Thank you. I'm wondering, in your teaching, do you make any analogies to string playing with respect to articulation of notes and playing the music? I'm asking because I'm primarily a string player, but also like secondarily have on and off been learning cornetto. And I think the way I think primarily is string. So maybe it's not as applicable as voice, but just wondering if you go there too.
Well, you know, the thing I think about the violin is that if you go into a resonant acoustic, the cornetto very quickly becomes indistinct and blurred. And the violin doesn't, because the violin has a much richer overtone structure. And so the violin is always more clear than the cornetto. And so I think that one thing that cornetto players need to take from string players is that clarity. And I always say to cornetto players, don't be afraid to play short notes, because short notes do not imply accents. So you can play bum bum beam bum bee dum beam bum bee, and not ta da ta da ta da ta da ti. Because if you do that and trying to play with the violin, it's not going to match at all. That's one thing. Another thing is the violin down up bow thing. We need to come close to that on the cornetto with our unequal tonguing. Part of that is with tara 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 or whatever, but some of it is also, even if you're single tonguing, ta ta ti ta ti ta ti ta ti ta ti ta ti ta 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 ti ta ti. But you know, there's a very interesting page. I don't know if you know the little book by Francesco Rognoni, his division method, and he has a page where he talks about bowing in the upper half. He calls it lireggiare on the violin, and the second half of the page is il modo di suonare il cornetto, and with tonguing syllables written under the notes. And often the same patterns occur. For example, tam da 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 dum tam tam da 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 ding ti, and the violin has a slur tam tam ti tam tam ti. The cornetto, when it has the same figure, has tam ta da la da lum ta ta diddle diddle lum ta. So these tonguing syllables on the cornetto can be equivalent to slurring on the violin. And there's a sonata of Rognoni for two violins or cornetti, which has many of these very same figures in it. And I experimented once with a violinist, both of us doing the slurring, the bowings and tonguings that Rognoni recommends. And both of us felt like the result was far more legato than we were used to playing, much more slurring than we were used to. And the tonguings on the cornetto sounded more slurred than what I'm accustomed to. So I think there's a lot there to experiment with and a lot to learn from each other, for the violin and the cornetto.
And then we will just take one more question, maybe if we can figure this out from the chat. It's from Mark Choi. He says, thank you for the very informative talk. May I ask, who are the composers for the music in the pieces you mentioned? And he's talking about Poland or Eastern Europe, so or outside of Germany and Italy. And he follows up, are there local composers, or was the music brought in or traveled? Was it brought into the churches?
Yeah, okay. So Brno, Moravia is a special case because the city of Brno is quite close to Vienna. And they were very much under the spell of Vienna. So the chapel masters of this church, the principal church in Brno, part of their job was to compose or collect music in the Viennese style, in the new Viennese style. So a lot of the music that's there is by Caldara and Bertali and others. But some of it is also, the majority of it is by local Moravian composers, with most of them German-speaking names, because Brno was largely a German-speaking city at that time. But names that you've never heard of. That's not quite the same. In Poland, there were many more Italians working. So you do find Italian music there, and also Italian music arranged by Polish chapel masters for slightly different forces. But there are also many, many Polish names, composers, Milczewski and Jarzemski, and the other ones don't come to me right at the moment, but there's a huge amount of music in Poland by Polish or German-speaking, because the borders kept shifting between Germany and Poland. But yeah, there's a certain amount of Italian music that you find all over Italy, but all over Europe and Northern Europe. But there's also a lot of locally produced music, often in Italian style or Italianate style, but not always.
I think it's probably time for me to start bringing this wonderful, wonderful meeting to close. I wanted to say, first of all, I forgot to mention that, first of all, I did mention that this will eventually wind up on the Historic Brass Society YouTube channel. And so that will be something good to look forward to. If you wanted to go back and review anything, or if you haven't seen it, if your friends haven't seen it, you can tell them about that.
Will you be able to edit out my bumbling with my screen sharing and
what we'll do is focus, we'll zoom in on the bumbling, and no, we won't. We'll try to figure out something. I did forget to mention that the HBS gives out an award for important people in the historic community. And in 2000, Bruce Dickey won the Christopher Monk Award. And so just want to make sure that's an important award. And of course, we all want to know what you have done with your money from that award. No, I'm just, it's not a monetary, it's all the glory.
I could turn my computer and show the plaque on the wall. It's right there.
Wonderful. But I did want, because we have such a large amount of cornetto players here, that if you haven't joined the Historic Brass Society, please consider doing that, because we all could use your expertise and your enthusiasm. And so just go to the website and follow the breadcrumbs to join. But in addition, if you have any interesting research that you've been thinking about and doing research, please contact us. You can contact me or anybody, and for possible inclusion in a future journal article. If you have any performances that you would like to focus on, then I'm sure there will be future events that we would love to have you perform on. So please consider that. And then I guess the final thing is to say thank you so much, Bruce, for all of your time and expertise and just wonderful musicality, for sharing that with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed it very much.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And I'm going to sign off. Thanks for sharing your time with us too.
Bye, everyone. Be well.
Grazie, signore.